Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ATRL Charts podcast. My name is Alexander, and I'm joined by my co-host Aaron. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Aaron, and I go by Mitch on ATRL. So thank you everyone for joining us after a long, long hiatus, but we are finally back.
Now, before we begin the episode in earnest, I'd like to talk a little bit about our backgrounds. And we originally had the idea for this podcast nearly 3 years ago, during the summer of 2015. Aaron was one of the original co-hosts, and with the help of several others, we ended up producing 11 episodes, I think it was, from then until February of 2016, before the whole thing kind of just tapered off. It wasn't until well after we stopped making the podcast that I realized just how much I enjoyed doing it. And I've had an untapped desire to bring it back for a while now, and this episode is really a manifestation of that. So, this is a podcast about the curiosities of the charts. We talk about a wide variety of things from broad industry trends to predictions for future hits to questions regarding artist management to chart policy. And we try to cover a lot of different topics within each episode. At the end of the day, our main goal is simply to share our enthusiasm for the charts and to help explain them to others who might be interested in knowing more about them. So, with that being said, let's dive into today's podcast. We resume our podcast at a very hectic time in the music industry. And the big story today, and really for the entirety of this week, is Drake. His new album Scorpion, projected by Hits Daily Double, previously to debut with around 900,000 album equivalent units with a record streaming total of around 900 million streams. The projections were lowered significantly today, but only due to a dip in pure sales.
Yes. And then there are a lot of people who really notice that, but at the end of the day, honestly, these numbers are still astronomical for anybody, even for Drake, And I believe that there was information that went out that he already broken the 1 week streaming record in just 3 days, which is, again, amazing. And I think a lot of people have already mentioned, well, the album has 20 some odd tracks, which is true, but it just shows that people are interested to hear what Drake is putting out, whether he had made, a 10 track album, 15, 20, whatever, he is a very attractive person in terms of music, and he's going to get a lot of streams regardless. And, I predicted this months ago that he was going to break streaming records left and right. Everybody kind of predicted that, but we did not realize, that he would break the streaming record of 1 week in just 3 days. And I think you could co-sign to that as well.
Yeah, what he's doing is pretty incredible, and he broke the streaming record with Views, he broke it again with More Life, and now he's breaking it again with Scorpion. Um, and of course, people are debating as to whether the decline in pure sales is reflective of a decline in his popularity, which I think it's obviously not. Um, it's rather indicative of the general music industry trend at the moment, which of course is to lower sales and higher streaming. But what is a more interesting debate is whether the long album helps its streaming. There's been a lot of controversy on the forum over whether it's true that having a long bloated track list like Amigos, Culture 2, which had 24 tracks or something like that, or a Chris Brown who went really extreme and he had 45 tracks on his standard, 57 tracks on his deluxe, whether that actually helps your streaming numbers or whether it hurts. I mean, you could make a case both ways. You could say that, well, core fans are going to listen to an album no matter what. They're going to stream it all the way through, and so a longer album helps. Or you could say that maybe casual fans are turned off by a long album and they'll only listen to some of it, and so therefore it hurts. I mean, this is an argument that can really go both ways.
That's true. And I think in the case of fans who want to hear who wants to hear album tracks, they're going to listen to it regardless. Whether I feel like if it's 5 tracks versus 50 tracks, a true fan is going to listen to all of those. But someone who's a casual fan of Drake or artists who have an inflated track list, they may, like you said, listen to maybe 12 of the 20 tracks or 15 of the 30 tracks. They're not going to listen to everything, but in the long run, in terms of charts and sales and certifications, it's going to help them in the long run. So I believe they're probably thinking more on the business front in terms of, all right, if I have more tracks, I think we're going to get more streams definitely, and I think it's going to increase the album equivalence for the album. And in the long run, you're going to have, I guess, more of a better consumption for the album. And I think when artists do that, I think they're thinking more on the business front and not necessarily, about the general public or whatever. And especially with Drake, because I think Drake could get away with putting out an album with 25 tracks because he's gonna get a lot of people to stream his songs. He's the streaming artist of our generation, and there's no denying that. So I think with him, he can get away with that. With other artists, some artists who may not be as profit driven as Drake may, step back and not put so many tracks on and maybe save those for another album. So I think again, it's more of a business model, in that sense.
Yeah, and I like the point you made about it potentially having larger effects in the long run than in the short run. Because in the long run, people can always come back to an album and they might have, they simply might have more material to discover. If you're talking about an album with long tracks versus an album with, 7 or 8 songs, like a 24 Karat Magic or a 17 or a Without Warning. Um, but the truth is that there are examples that go both ways. So you have an album that is very long, like Chris Brown's, and it could still be far less successful than an album like 24 Karat Magic. So while tracklist is certainly one factor, I don't think it's the deciding one, and I'm not sure that it is even a significant one.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And going back onto the point where, like you said, with people who do that and see less success, I think that's also attributed to the fact that you can in this age, if you don't have a hit on your album, your streaming numbers probably are not going to do very well. Now, again, Drake is the exception to all of this. He can put out an album. He can put out an album and you know not have any hits per se or like something that's not as popular. But again, people are still going to stream, stream, stream. Whereas when Chris Brown put out his album, to my knowledge, I mean, he didn't have any huge hits from that album. So after the first month or two after the album release, his album just kind of tumbled down the charts, if you will, because he didn't have a hit. So again, with artists that are singles driven and want to, increase I guess, the number of tracks on their album, they're gonna have to make sure to have a hit. And because these days, you are not gonna see any like major consumption from the album unless you have that hit single that's constantly been played on the radio or in clubs or whatever. So I think that's also an important factor to realize when contracting these hit lists. I mean these albums.
And a point that's kind of related to that, that's interesting, is the kind of attachment of previous singles onto albums to, I guess you could call it inflate their streaming numbers. People often are releasing standalone singles maybe for way different purposes, and yet they get tacked on to an album, that comes out 6 months or 8 months or 10 months after that single was released. Like a prime example of that, for example, is Post Malone. Put out the single Candy Paint for the Fast and Furious 7 soundtrack for that movie. That was well before Beer Bongs and Bentleys was finished, but it ended up on the final track list for that album. And it became a moderate hit, and it certainly helped the streaming numbers for that album, although they didn't need much help in the first place. But that's a trend that's becoming more common That's a trend that's becoming more common. We saw it, I guess, to quite an extreme level early on with Charlie Puth, who did that with both 9 Track Mind and his new album Voice Notes. He tacked attention onto that album despite it being released nearly a year before. Maroon 5, Don't Want to Know, they did it too. So this is definitely becoming a trend in the industry. Whether it is something to be regulated, that's another point of contention.
Right, and going along with that, I think it's smart when artists and labels see the opportunity to release an album while the single is at its peak, because I feel like there are a lot of artists who release albums well after a single has peaked or it's not doing so well in streaming or sales, because to get a number one album, you have to have sales, but you also have to have the streams and the track sales to boost up the number on Billboard 200. And I feel like I've been seeing lately, like for example, BB Rexa, Meant to Be was a pretty big hit, maybe about a month or two ago. It was doing pretty good in streams, and then I remember being the number one seller for maybe a week or two on the digital song sales charts. Now that would have helped her probably get into the top 10 on Billboard 200, but Meant to Be has pretty much peaked. Her new single has not taken off yet. And I feel like her label pretty much missed out on her album going top 10 when she would have released Meant to Be while it was still fresh and hot on the streaming side and on the digital track side. But, I don't know what goes behind labels and when they figure out when to release an album, how to release an album. I guess that's another conversation for another day. But I think that would help labels a lot if they're aiming for, bragging rights of having a top 10 album or even having a number one album.
Yeah, that's a great point. And going back to Scorpion, Scorpion has had quite the effort behind it. A massive takeover of Spotify's front page. Drake was on the cover of dozens of different playlists, a lot of them seemingly unrelated to anything Drake has ever done. He was on the cover of Fresh Gospel. He was on the cover of a bachata playlist. He was on the cover of some Chinese and Japanese playlists. He really was everywhere. And they've since confirmed that this was an official kind of partnership between Drake's team and Spotify. And a lot of people think that this is really Spotify trying to outdo Apple Music and get larger streaming numbers for the biggest release of the year, because, of course, Apple Music traditionally is where urban artists are getting most of their streams from. And yet, Spotify appears to have, at least the early indication is that Spotify has failed to beat Apple Music. The first day of streaming, Apple Music reported 170 million worldwide streams for Scorpion, and Spotify reported a little bit over 130 million. So it's a closer margin than usual. But Apple Music still reigns supreme among urban artists.
Yeah, and to me it's shocking, but it's not, because I know a lot of my friends who listen to urban music. A lot of them have Apple Music, and they always ask me, "Oh, what do you use? Do you use Apple Music or Spotify?" And I say both. But a lot of people have iPhones. They have a lot of Apple products, so I think they started they kind of just stay loyal to Apple Music. And honestly, I did not predict that Apple Music would be overtaking Spotify at some point, but we are in that time frame. And as you can see, Apple Music and Spotify both have the same, I guess, membership price. Both are $9.99 a month. So you have to look at that as well. But also, I think Apple Music is starting to become more mainstream when it comes to users and things like that. But it is interesting to see that urban music dominates on Apple Music, and most of the times you see pop songs maybe creep up in the top 10, here and there, but for the most part, it's you have your Drakes, you have your Cardi B's, you have your Beyonce, Jay-Z's that are dominating that platform. So it'll be interesting to see how much of more of a domination they're going to have over the next few years, and how pop music or pop music, dance music, or any other type of genre is going to do better on that platform.
And just to put some numbers into this discussion, Apple Music has, according to a report from Verto Analytics conducted this February, Apple Music has 49.5 million monthly unique users in the United States, which is only a little bit above Spotify's 47.7 million, although the same report did note that Spotify users are in general far more engaged than Apple Music users. They use their platform more, they spend longer using Spotify than Apple Music users spend using Apple Music. Um, so it's a dogfight. And these are the clear top two streaming services. Back in 2015, when we first started this podcast, Spotify was far and away the dominant player. That is no longer the case. It's going to be an intense battle for supremacy in this market. Not likely to slow down anytime soon. But the one advantage that Spotify does have over Apple Music, and the one that Drake tried to capitalize on, is its playlist ecosystem. And there's been a lot of controversy over its playlist ecosystem. A lot of people think it's just, a dignified form of radio payola. A lot of people think that it's just in place to make sure that the major labels can give their artists hits and crowd out the indie artists. A lot of indie artists have been really upset with Spotify. Um, so what are your overall thoughts on the Spotify playlist ecosystem? Is it beneficial to artists? Is it dignified payola? How much of an impact does it really have on hits?
Honestly, I believe that the playlist payola that everyone calls it, honestly, I think it's beneficial to a lot of artists. Is it manipulation? Sure, a little bit. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there's manipulation in the music industry all over. Um, but the thing with these playlists is that, you know, you're not forced to listen to these songs. So if you hear a song that you don't like, you skip it. And I'm pretty sure there is a metric that captures how long a song is streamed for before it's skipped, and whether that counts for the charts or not. That's up to Spotify or whomever makes that determination. But again, if a song comes on, if I'm listening to today's top hits, I'll listen to song A, song B. Oh, I don't like song C. Song C, I'm going to skip it. So users still have the right to control what they listen to. It's not like they're being forced to listen to these songs. And then with today's top hits and every other Spotify playlist, you get to see what's on that playlist before you hit play. So let's say if you're listening to New Music Friday, which is another huge playlist, you want to see all the new songs. You say, oh, let me hit play. I love this song. I love that song. Oh, wait, I don't feel this. Let me skip it. So with that sense, again, you're not being forced to listen to anything. You are giving the opportunity to discover, new music. You're giving the opportunity to discover things that are curated based on what you play. But do I feel like it's an unfair advantage to other artists? I mean, again, it's the way the game is played in this industry. If your label is willing to, shell out the money to put you on 70,000 playlists or however many playlists there is on Spotify, then that's up to the label. I feel like if the label wants to push the artist in that way, go for it. Again, you don't have the option. You don't have the choice. You don't have. What am I trying to say? You're not being forced to sit down and listen to song A or song B. You can clearly go into the playlist and say, oh wait, let me play this song instead. So honestly, I think it is a great way to discover music, because I've actually discovered a lot of new songs on Spotify just listening to the playlist and listening to um, like things on New Music Friday, today's top hits. For example, I'll just be honest with you. Like, there was a song a couple years ago called "Capsized" by Friendship. Now, apparently, that song had been spammed to death on Spotify. I didn't find out about it until maybe, yeah, I didn't find out about it until maybe months after, and then it started appearing in some of my curated playlists, and I was like, oh, I love this song. Okay, then so much that I actually downloaded it on iTunes. So, I discover a lot of new music based on the playlist, based on the things that come up on the homepage. So I think it is a very good way to get artists, known or get their hits out there. But then, there are labels that, want to do things, and I know ATRL will like this word, do things organically and just let songs be on their own. But for new artists, you're really not gonna have that exposure unless you're put onto certain playlists like today's top hits or Rap Caviar, or the most popular playlist for R&B music, which is titled actually R&B. Um, so I think it's a great exposure tool, but is it payola? Yes, in some ways, but again, that's just the leg of the lamb, and that's just kind of how the music industry works.
Yeah, it's such an interesting debate, and it's one that's not going away anytime soon. One of the more important debates in the industry right now. Playlists increasingly becoming important in ways that a lot of people didn't expect them to back in 2015 when we were first recording this podcast. Back to Scorpion. Time for some predictions. Of course, Ariana Grande's album is coming out in around a month and a half on August 17th. Will she be blocked by Drake?
Good question. Because with views, he spent about I'm not sure the exact number, but he
13
spent
weeks,
about
but
10.
non-consecutive. He
Yeah.
spent 9 consecutive, and then one he lost to Blink 182, I believe, and then had three more consecutive. And Ariana came out in the third week of that first run.
Okay. So again, he has the history of reigning the charts, with views because views was kind of a perfect storm for Drake. He not only did he have, you know, the streams to back himself up, but then One Dance was such a huge hit. And it was one of the first songs to pass a billion views, a billion streams on Spotify. So One Dance was pretty huge, and he kept them afloat for a long time. And then also he had, Controller and Too Good, which were also really big streaming hits as well. So he had that going for him. This time around, he has God's Plan, which is still pretty big. Nice for What, which is also huge. And, the Michael Jackson collaboration could take off, which I see that's being promoted on today's top hits as the number one song. So I don't know if the label is planning on making that, I guess, the next single from the album. But I honestly believe that there is a possibility that she could be blocked. The thing with Drake is you never know how quickly his singles are going to take off, but when they take off, they pretty much don't leave the top of the charts. You had Hotline Bling that kind of came out of nowhere. Then you had One Dance that kind of came out of nowhere as well. And then obviously we've seen with God's Plan and Nice for What, those were hits literally straight out the gate. They both debuted at number one. They both were huge hits, and some people have been kind of comparing this singles era to what happened with Black Eyed Peas years ago when their first two singles were pretty much huge right out the gate, and you kind of never really see that type of domination, um, all the time. So it's interesting to see what's happening with the Scorpion era. But I guess to make things simpler or to get to the point, I do think there's a chance that she will be blocked. Um, I think the label realizes that because I think they're on the same distribution label, and I don't think Scooter Braun is going to go out with a fight with Ariana. So I do think that they're going to do everything they can to make sure she gets the number one, but it's going to be a challenge. I really think it's going to be a challenge for her.
Yeah, it's a great point that they're both on Republic Records, and so it would seem unlikely at first glance that Drake would block Ariana, but his longevity, you can already tell that it's just going to be so strong. His first week already is being mostly fueled by streaming, perhaps 500, 600,000 units just from streaming equivalents. Um, and that's just an indication of how great his longevity could be. Now, More Life, even More Life was doing above 100,000 into its fourth, fifth week, I believe, or close to it. And Views was doing more than that. And this we're only talking about 6 weeks from now. Um, so I really think Ariana not only needs Drake to at least like fall off a little bit, she also needs to have a great week herself. She can't go out and do 90K, do 100K, and expect to get number one. No way. She needs to pull 150, 160, 170,000, and then I think she'll have at least a decent chance at number one. But again, Drake is going to be so strong all summer. I doubt that he will not put up a fight, inadvertently as it may be. So I will say right now, I'm going to give Drake a 60% chance of blocking Ariana Grande for number one on the Billboard 200, just as he did with Views. And that'll be an interesting storyline to follow in the weeks to come. But now we're going to transition and talk about another high profile album release that occurred a couple weeks back, and that was the Carters. Their joint album, Everything Is Love, was initially just on Apple Music in title. It had a very brief window on Spotify where it was available to only premium users, and then it quickly became available to all Spotify users. Despite that, it debuted at number 2 behind 5 Seconds of Summer, who were powered by a ticket bundle. And a strong single, Young Blood, which has had surprisingly good streaming numbers across the board. What's your reaction to this album and this release and this number 2 debut?
I honestly was very shocked at this, but then when I realized how the album was rolled out, then I was like, you know what? I'm not that shocked. Honestly, I think at this point, Beyonce and Jay Z realize if you want a number one album in this day and time, you know, you are going to have to be in tune with your fan base. And to be honest, their fan base does not use title. Their fan base is not are not title users. They'll sign up for the 30 days that title is free, then they'll delete it or get rid of it. I think that hurt them a lot because let's just be honest. Compared to Spotify and Apple Music and even Amazon Prime, the streaming service used with Amazon Prime, no one is really using title like that. You know, it's just an honest fact. Um, with that being said, and then they expanded it to Apple Music and then to Spotify, but only the premium users of Spotify. I think that kind of hurt them in terms of the amount of streams that they could have gotten if they had opened it up to all the streaming platforms on its release date. But you know, with them being very huge stakeholders in their own business of title, then obviously they're going to give exclusivity to their core audience, if you will. And I think that hurt them. Obviously, no one expected them to be blocked by a boy band, so I think that ruffled a lot of feathers, obviously on ATRL and a lot of other places in Stan world. But I think it was a realization that you can't be exclusive in this day and age unless you're going to pull millions and millions and hundreds of millions of streams from that one platform. But when you have a very small number of subscribers in comparison to Spotify and out of Apple Music, it's just not going to work. But then again, we can also look at this in a way that maybe they don't care about having a number one album since they have so many, which could be the case. I don't know. I don't know how the Carters think, but in terms of longevity, it's not going to have. Obviously, it's not going to have Scorpion in longevity, and it's definitely not going to have Post Malone longevity because of the way that this album was rolled out, and I'm not sure if even this album is going to be continued to be promoted beyond the tour and the lead single, Ape Pool. I don't want to curse on the podcast, but I'm not sure after this single and like after the tour is done, I'm not sure if this album is going to just have legs like Lemonade did or Jay-Z's previous album, not 444, but the album that he released a few years ago, Magna Carta Holy Grail. I'm not seeing the longevity for that, and I just think, a lot of Beyonce fans, they want to hear Beyonce solo, and then a lot of Jay-Z fans want to hear Jay-Z solo. So I think the idea of them having this joint album it was just a disaster, like coming from different ends, which kind of resulted in them debuting at number 2. But the title Apple Music exclusive, and then only having it available to premium users of Spotify, it just kind of hurt them in the long run. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, and there was a lot of debate on ATRL as to whether the blame could be ascribed to Jay-Z alone, or whether it could be ascribed to Beyonce or to both of them for thinking that a joint album was a good idea. People pointed to Lemonade numbers and to 444's numbers and saying, oh, Lemonade did so much better, and so therefore it was Jay-Z's fault. And that might be a little bit simplistic, but there is kind of an idea that they're trying to get at, that people listened to the album for a specific artist, and that's an interesting idea because joint albums in the past, you think an album like Watch the Throne, for example, people didn't listen to that just for Kanye. At least that's my opinion. They listened to it for the two of them, their star power combining together. So it's interesting to see that school of thought emerge for this album specifically. And with regard to exclusives, it's true they've fallen out of favor with both artists and executives over the past few years. I mean, they were all the rage on Apple Music for its first year of existence. We had so many of them: Drake, Travis Scott, Frank Ocean, you name it. But people have since realized, and I think rightly so, that they're bad for everybody. They're bad for the artist because it limits chart success. They're bad for the fans because it locks out some fans from listening to the album. Um, and so they've pretty much stopped using them. I cannot remember the last time this year that there was a major exclusive album. I'm trying to rack my brain. Hopefully I'm not forgetting anything too obvious, but I can't remember one.
I don't think there was an exclusive album this year. Um, yeah, I think the last exclusive album prior to the Carters or Everything Is Love was last year with maybe Jay Z himself. But other than that, I don't think there was an exclusive album this year. But again, we are moving into an era where streaming is streaming is here, and in order, if your music wants to be consumed, you're gonna have to be available at the very least on Spotify or Apple Music. And if you're not there, then people are not really going to really go to the mile to look for your song unless you're a fan. Unless you're a hardcore fan, then obviously you're gonna download the song on iTunes, which is what most hardcore fans do. But the casual fan who listens to the radio or who just are people who are just interested in music in general, their first thing is to pull up Spotify, Apple Music, and if they have a Prime membership, go to Amazon. But chances are they are not going to go to Tidal because of its limited exposure in general. But again, that's another conversation for another day. I don't want to ruffle too many feathers, but yeah, that's just how it is.
All right, so let's pivot to a topic that has been an interesting one to talk about lately, and that is radio. Now, radio, unlike sales, has generally maintained its audience in the streaming era. People are still listening to radio at high rates. It still remains one of the most popular forms of media consumption in the United States. That said, pop radio has arguably become a little bit more out of touch lately. A lot of its biggest hits have simply not been big hits overall. Um, and I think we should just talk about a few of those that reached number one on pop radio and yet missed the top 10 on the Hot 100. That was a relatively rare feat, but it's already happened a couple times this year. Um, for example, with G-Eazy and Halsey, their song Him and I went number one on pop radio and missed the Hot 100 top 10. You had a song like I Like Me Better by I can't pronounce his name, but that song, despite not showing any signs of life on any other platforms, it's rising on pop radio in its 40th week or whatever it is. It's been on the chart forever and it's still rising. Radio seems to be operating more independently of other services and other platforms than ever.
Yeah, and that's very interesting to watch. And then going along with what you were saying with G Easy and Halsey, Him and I, you also had Let You Down by NF, um, which was a number one song on pop radio, but barely missed the Hot 100 or the top 10 on the Hot 100. I think it started at 12. But it's been happening a lot more, and I think I made a thread about it a few months ago or a few weeks ago. There were way more number one pop songs that missed the top 10 this year than there has been in the last 4 or 5 years. So I think, honestly, and I've said this a few times in threads and like in passing, but there are radio stations that, as you said, operate independently no matter what. You know, you have your radio stations that that are probably controlled by, you know, record labels or whatever, and maybe that's a whole nother thing. But I honestly, genuinely believe that there are some radio stations that play what, you know, what their listeners like, you know, and I think we see that sometimes in the call out scores, which basically, if you don't know what call out scores are, they are basically measurements of how likable a song is on the radio, and it's like a survey that people take online um, that determines those scores. But going along with that, I think some of these songs that are lasting such a long time, or you know, hitting top five on pop radio without these, you know, stream supports or sales supports, are getting really good call outs. Like, for example, I mean, we see this right now, and I'm not being a hater to anyone, but Taylor Swift's Delicate. It is top five on pop radio, or almost top five on pop radio. It's doing okay in the sales department. I think it's like top 15 on iTunes, but it is barely top 200 on Spotify, which is a huge disconnect for a song that's currently rising, you know, on pop radio. So I think, again, with Delicate, it has great call out scores, so people like to hear the song on radio, but maybe they're not willing to, you know, buy the song, because there are songs I may listen to the radio sometimes and may not necessarily want to download it or, you know, continuously stream it. Maybe I just like hearing it as it's on the radio if I'm like in a car or you know, out in public or something like that. So I think call out scores are becoming more important in that sense, because no matter if it's doing poorly on sales or streaming, there is a place where people can still listen to the song and, you know, and feel, you know, and enjoy the song, if you will. So I think call out scores are becoming more important in this day and in this day and age.
And I guess a follow up question to that, that's kind of an interesting point you bring up, is streaming is clearly growing. The amount of people that are streaming music continues to rise at a rapid rate. Um, but clearly, there's this disconnect between the streaming audience and the audiences of radio stations. Now, my question is, do you think that those audiences are going to eventually overlap? Do you think that a lot of the people listening to radio are currently not using streaming and they eventually will be? Or are they bound to stay disconnected? Is it that people are just abandoning radio for streaming, and thus the audiences are getting even more disconnected, and radio will continue to operate, independently of streaming?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think in that sense, I think radio listeners. I honestly believe that radio listeners do stream from time to time. You know, you have pop radio stations, for example, here in New York City, Z100, the biggest radio station in the country. I'm pretty sure 80% of those people who listen to Z100 have streamed before, because we have a lot of millennials in New York City and a lot of young teenagers and young adults in the city who have a smartphone and are going to pick up the phone and either download a song that they like on the radio or stream it once they heard it or something like that. Um, so yeah, in that sense, I think that there are people, who still use streaming, but then you have places or pop stations and, places where streaming may not be dominant, but it's coming along. And with that being said, I do think that the audiences will overlap at some point in those markets where streaming is not the dominant factor. But in terms of seeing that reflection on the charts, like on the streaming charts and on pop radio, I'm not sure how long that's going to take. But again, radio sometimes I think it's going to just go ahead and act independently and just play the songs based on, call out scores. So if they see that, oh, look at this, this song X is top. This is a top song in our call outs. they're probably not even going to think about going to look at, oh, how's this doing in streaming, how's this doing in the sales department. They're probably not gonna look at that. They're just gonna see, this song is testing really well with our listeners. We're gonna continue to play it. But a station like Z100, I'm almost sure that they do a lot of research, with the call out scores, but then also look at the consumption side of that because, you have a lot of songs on Z100 that get radio played and you see them do well on Spotify, or I shouldn't just say Spotify in general, but they do well on streaming. So I think Z100, an example, is in touch with that consumption audience, but you do have your disconnects with other radio stations as well. So, I guess it varies between market to market and from radio station to radio station.
Yeah, and that's a great point because there are so many different radio stations. There are several hundred on the pop panel alone, from small towns to big cities, from Middle America to the coasts, from the South to the Northwest. There's so much variance that I agree. Probably shouldn't generalize among all of them. Um, and now to move to a slightly different topic, and that is the topic of ticket bundles. Now, ticket bundles were not really in vogue when we were first recording this podcast, but in the last year and a half or so, they've become an incredibly popular method for, some would say, manipulating the Billboard 200 and securing high debuts on that chart. The way it works, if you haven't heard of a ticket bundle before, but you probably have if you're listening to this podcast, is that when artists go on tours, they can offer a free complimentary copy of their album to go along with every ticket purchase. So when you, as a consumer, buy a ticket to their tour, you are given like a link or a code to redeem your free CD. Usually comes in CD form. And you don't have to pay anything extra for the CD, but when you do redeem it, it counts the same as an album sale. And so ticket bundles can lead to really, really inflated first weeks for a lot of acts that are not strong in streaming. We're talking about rock bands like Metallica, adult pop artists like Pink, who have both used it to great effect. And often people who use ticket bundles will drop off drastically in the weeks to come because they're not fueled by anything else. So I guess the question here is this chart manipulation? Is it a moral thing to do? Is there a way to fix it? Is there a way to quantify touring on the album chart in a more accurate way?
Yeah, oh my gosh, this is a really good question, and I have so many mixed feelings about it. Um, to answer your first question, yes, it definitely is chart manipulation, um, in a sense because Billboard themselves have stated that the Hot 100 and the Billboard 200 are reflective of popularity. So, going on example, when Metallica came out of nowhere and shot back to number one on the charts a few months ago, it was like, wait, what? Like, how did that happen? Then we realized that they had a tour bundle with some tickets that fans had redeemed. Now, let's just be honest. Now, out of those people who redeemed their ticket to get the album, how many of them actually, consumed that album that week? It raises so many questions of, okay, well, if they redeem the album, are they listening to the album? Like, did they even get it in the mail? Like, it raises so many questions, and I think in that sense it is chart manipulation because obviously the label is fighting for to get the top spot on the Billboard 200, which again from a business point, do what you need to do, but when it comes to popularity, I'm sorry, but that Metallica album I don't think was the most popular album of that week. I forget which album it blocked, but I don't think it was the most popular album of that week. And going along with what Billboard has been preaching, and the thing that they preach every single week in their article, it says the Billboard 200 is a reflection of popularity based on album sales, streams, and track sales. And with that being said, I just think that it is manipulation, and I think they really need to look into how they handle tickets or album sales through ticket bundling for for future reference. And I know that it's going to take a while for them to do research on this and try to figure out how to please both crowds. But again, the Billboard 200 and the Hot 100 are both living, um, living species, if you will. They're not going to always be the same from week to week, and everything needs work and everything needs improvement. So, with that being said, I do think that there should be some type of regulation when it comes to ticket bundling and album sales, because it's clearly not a reflection of true popularity. Now, for the first week, that's one thing, but when you have ticket bundling that occurs, in this case for Metallica, almost well over a year after the album has come out, and they don't even really have a single on the radio. I don't think. I mean, I don't follow the rock airplay charts a lot, but um, it just didn't make any sense. I think in that instance, when you have ticket bundling that's occurring months and years after the album has come out, then Billboard should step up and say, all right, look, maybe this is something that we should regulate for our own sake and kind of look into to see what we can do differently to reflect the popularity of this album, of the Metallica album, or any other album, or any other artist that decides to do that well after the album has come out. So that's kind of like where I stand on it.
Right, and like you said, it just intuitively seems wrong when an album jumps back up to number one after a lengthy absence from the top 40 just because of bundles. And I think one of the possible solutions that I think should be floated, for example, let's say that a consumer is required to pay the equivalent price for the album to get the album. Or let's say that tickets that come bundled with the album cost more by the amount that the album costs. You just got to factor in that price there. And I know that some people might call that, double counting, because it's true. The supplier does pay for the album that's being bundled. Like, those copies that you get for free aren't really free. The distributor has to purchase those. So you could argue that that's double counting of a sale, but I don't agree, and I think that it would be better for ticket bundles that are completely free, where the album is just redeemable for free, should probably be regulated. But again, this is a sensitive issue. It's becoming increasingly relevant because the bundle has just become so popular. I mean, you look up at the 200, and pretty much every artist debuting with high sales marks has it. It's rare to find an artist now that debuts, you know, that has a mostly sales fueled debut, if I can talk, that isn't powered by bundles. So this is definitely an important issue, and one that's not going away anytime soon. Um, Another thing that we kind of touched on earlier, that has changed a lot since we first started podcasting, is the rise of Apple Music, and its challenge to Spotify. And with Spotify being a public company now, a public company that has to focus on being profitable above everything else, they're really in a tougher position than they've been in the past couple of years right now.
Yeah, I think with Spotify, they are definitely trying to, I guess, if you will, keep up, keep their heads above water, making sure everything is regulated, and making sure that they're not only pleasing, their customers, their consumers, but also pleasing their shareholders. Because see now, you have people that have stock in your product, so you have to make sure that everything's dot your T's, or dot your I's, cross your T's. Apple has been doing this for many decades, so they kind of have a sense of how to balance their business. But with Spotify becoming public, there are definitely things that they have to abide by, and making sure that they are, I guess, on their P's and Q's with everything. And I think recently, with the influx of streaming and everything, like the amount of consumption that streaming has gone through in the last couple years, Spotify has to definitely keep up with Apple Music, and they have a lot of people that are probably going to be sitting on their board of directors, telling them how to, go about doing things and how to go about staying, obviously staying relevant, which they won't have a problem with that. But now they see that Apple Music is has caught up to them and has surpassed them in some ways, then that definitely has raised some concerns. I'm sure with the CEO Daniel Ek and everyone else who works with Spotify. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next couple of years. But I'm just gonna say for myself, I'm never giving up Spotify. I love it. I have both Spotify and Apple Music because I can bounce between one and the other. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see how this battle goes out between the two. I guess colossal streaming giants.
And Spotify not only has to worry about competition from Apple Music, it has to worry about its relationships with the major labels. Now, recently, there was a big story that broke that Spotify is attempting to directly license directly license music from certain artists that remained unnamed. They were offering advances and appealing business terms to artists that would directly license their music to Spotify. This kind of idea of Spotify becoming a record label has been floated by a lot of people. There have been a lot of Netflix comparisons because that's the method by which Netflix became a very profitable company in and of itself. But in retaliation to that, it was reported in Music Business Worldwide that the labels were threatening to block Spotify's territorial licensing. Spotify has plans to expand in India later this year, and the labels wanted, in retaliation to that move, wanted to block that. So every step that Spotify takes to try and become more profitable is probably going to cut into the label's income. And Spotify, of course, has to maintain these great relationships with the labels because otherwise the labels are the ones providing music to Spotify. So they're really walking a tightrope here, um, and yet they have to show continued profitability and continued growth because they've gone public. It's a very sticky situation.
And once you go public, it's you are you're under a microscope basically. Once before going public, you can kind of regulate at your own rules and your own risk. But once you are public, and this is very important, for those who don't realize what going public means, is that you have to comply pretty much with everything and anything by government regulations, the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission. You are basically being watched by Big Brother. So with Spotify, they may want to be careful with some of the things that they've been doing before going public, and want to, I guess, reevaluate some of the relationships that they have with labels and making sure that they are pleasing every side of the party that they can without, you know, completely just, wrecking everything. Because once things start to come out about a company, as you see stocks drop, um, shareholders pull out, big investors will probably pull out, and it just becomes it becomes a messy situation for, not only Spotify but those who are involved, with Spotify. So it's an interesting point to bring up, and it'll be something worthwhile to watch over the next couple.
Yeah, and Spotify definitely trying to show some ingenuity in their quest for profitability, which of course they are not a profitable company yet. Um, there were images circulating on social media several months ago that they were sending surveys to Spotify users, and I actually received one of these surveys. They asked, like, essentially, what would be the optimal price point for a bundle where you could buy a subscription to Spotify Premium and get a couple of vinyl records each month, or what would be the price? What would be the optimal price for you for a bundle that would include Spotify and a TV streaming service? So they're asking these questions. They're doing market research, and they're trying to figure out how to best get their users to spend money. Their end goal is to convert every single free user to a premium user. And if that requires bundling, so be it. They need those subscriptions to be profitable. That's one of the only ways that they can make money without making money at the expense of the labels. So subscriptions are so important for them.
Very, very easy to, not an easy job to get free users to go and spend money. So that's going to take some time. I was a free user for maybe about a year, but then I realized I got tired of not being able to stream things on demand. So I said, let me just spend the $10 a month and just do it. That was a few years ago, but now I think it becomes slightly easier when streaming when you realize how much you can stream at the tip of your fingers, or I guess at your fingertips. So I think people may be willing to shell out $10 a month or $5 if you are a college student, which is a very attractive price for college students. So I think Spotify realizes the importance of trying to get users to spend money because, as you said, they are not making profit, and I think with that, shareholders are going to be like, all right, well, why aren't you guys making profit? No profits means possibly no dividends, and then again, it just becomes a huge issue with shareholders, and then they may start to sell out or withdraw their interest from the company. So, yeah,
And a little bit of a disclaimer here, of course, Spotify stock has been doing well since the IPO in early April, but of course, they have to become profitable at some point, or else it will be a massive problem. Now, this question is in a way a question of who is Spotify's listener base. I mean, if we're talking about how do you get free users to buy subscriptions, that should theoretically not be impossible if a lot of the free users are big music fans. But is that really the case? Are a lot of free users more casual fans who are just turning on the app once every 5-10 days? I mean, the report that I cited earlier from Verto Analytics that talked about how Spotify users are much more dedicated than Apple Music users might be a suggestion otherwise, but it's interesting to think about because if a lot of the free users are casual fans, then you don't just have to turn them on to the idea of subscribing, you have to make them into big music fans in the first place before you can do that.
exactly. I think with that, as you mentioned, I think a lot of people who use Spotify are just those who download the app and just hit a playlist and just hit go. And that's again, you want to make sure that, well, for Spotify's case, they want to make sure that they are trying to keep that free user, but then also making sure somewhere down the road that they're getting that user to spend the $5 or $10 a month. Um, but I think a lot of casual listeners are okay with not spending money, and for the most part, they're not because they're saying, oh, this is free music. Whenever I have a gathering at my house, I have some friends over. I can put this baby onto the Bluetooth speaker, hit Saturday night playlist, and just go. Because again, like you said, a lot of people who listen to music are just casual listeners. They're not gonna care what's playing in the background because most of the time it's just ambient music for their gathering or whatever they're doing. So they don't care if Rihanna's playing or if Drake's playing as long as it's palatable enough for the people to have a good time. But then you have huge music fans like myself who don't mind paying for a little bit extra, who wants to have the curated playlist and for me to discover different new artists and different songs that I've never heard before. I think that subset of people would be willing to say, yeah, I think it's worth it to have something that's personalized towards me. And I think that's Spotify's biggest selling point because I feel like between the two, Spotify and Apple Music, they're best at curating what's best for you to listen to or like suggesting things that maybe you've never heard before, things that may interest you that you've heard before that you would like to hear again. Spotify does a really good job with that, and I think that needs to be one of their selling points when they're trying to upsell a free user to being premium.
And you're absolutely right. I'm just pulling up the SEC filing now that Spotify filed when they went public. And it's true that their personalized playlists are a bigger success, objectively, than their curated playlists. I'm quoting from their filing. We now program approximately 31% of all listening on Spotify across these and other playlists, and they're referring to personalized, machine generated playlists like Discover Weekly, Daily Mix, or Release Radar. And in comparison, that number is only 15% for curated playlists like Today's Top Hits or Rap Caviar, or the classic ones that you think about when you think about curated playlists. So that's an interesting point that you make. That it's true that the personalization aspect seems to really appeal to people, which is not surprising, but it's something that they can leverage in the future. Um, and another note that I think is related. Relevant to this topic is that in late April, Spotify actually released a redesigned app for free Spotify users, a redesigned Spotify app that improved the mobile experience. Previously, you could not play any playlists on demand on mobile. You can now play selected ones that Spotify chooses on demand on mobile. They also gave the app a new interface. They gave it some new features. So I think it really shows that they do care a lot about their free users, and they've always been the staunchest defenders of free streaming, across the industry. People for a long time were predicting that they would eventually try and phase out their free tier, but instead they're enhancing it, and they're trying to keep everybody that's on that tier with them, and keep their loyalty. And I think that's just a really telling business move, and it says a lot about where they want to go in the future.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if they keep on with that, I think they'll start to see, you know, profitability in that sense. And I think with with everything that's going on with competition arising with Apple Music, and then Amazon's on the rise. They really have to kind of stay ahead of themselves and kind of figure out, all right, what's the next best thing that we can offer to our subscribers, whether they be free or premium subscribers. What can we offer to them to make them stay and not want to move to another streaming service and potentially have them pay, if they're not if they're free customers with us. How can we retain them, even if they're going to be free customers? How can we retain them and not lose them to Apple Music or some other streaming service? So I think that's very important.
Sorry, a brief correction. 17% of all Spotify listens come from personalized playlists and 15% from curated playlists. So slightly more from personalized playlists. But yes, an interesting thing to think about. Spotify needs more subscriptions. They can never have enough. It's so important for them. And that just about wraps up what we were going to talk about for this podcast. In the past, we had a lot of recurring segments, such as a segment called "Will It Go Top 10," that where we talked about whether we thought songs on the come up would eventually go top 10. We are not including any of these segments in our first podcast, but in future podcasts we may include them. And we also want to take questions from you, the listeners. If you have any questions, any and all questions that you would like us to answer or give our opinions on, please comment them in the thread. By the time that you are hearing this podcast, a thread will be made in the chart section that you will be able to post your questions in, and we just might answer them on a future podcast. So thanks a lot for tuning in, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you very much.